September 16th, 1944. Adolf Hitler stood before his senior commanders in the Wolf's Lair and announced Germany would launch a massive offensive through the Ardennes forest, split the Allied armies in two, and capture the port of Antwerp. The room went silent, not because the generals were inspired, because they knew what Hitler apparently didn't. Germany no longer had the strength for grand offensives. They had barely enough strength to keep from collapsing. But nobody said that out loud. Not yet. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, 69 years old, Commander-in-Chief West, listened to Hitler describe the plan with the expression of a man watching a child explain how he'd build a castle from sand during high tide. Rundstedt had been brought out of retirement twice because Hitler kept running out of competent commanders. He was old, tired, and possessed exactly zero illusions about Germany's strategic position. When Hitler finished speaking, Rundstedt offered no objections. He simply nodded. Later, in private, he would call the plan a stroke of genius in a tone that made clear he meant the opposite. Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, had a different reaction. Model was younger, 53, still possessed some of the energy that had earned him a reputation as a defensive specialist on the Eastern Front. He looked at Hitler's map, traced the proposed advance with one finger, and saw the same problem everyone else did. This required fuel Germany didn't have, time Germany didn't have, and luck Germany had run out of months ago. But Model was also a loyal Nazi, which complicated his thinking. He wanted to believe it could work. He needed to believe it could work, because if this didn't work, nothing would. The plan Hitler described was audacious to the point of fantasy. 200,000 troops, 1,400 tanks, would punch through the weakly held American lines in the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, drive northwest to Antwerp, cutting off 4 Allied armies in the process. The British and Canadians would be isolated in the north. The Americans would be split and disorganized. The Allies would be forced to negotiate. Germany would gain time to deploy new wonder weapons. The Eastern Front could be reinforced. Everything would change. It was brilliant. It was also impossible. Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, was the first to say so, though carefully. Manteuffel was 47, a career officer, and one of the few German generals who'd learned to speak uncomfortable truths to Hitler without getting relieved or shot. He didn't challenge the offensive itself. He challenged the scope. Mein Führer, he said, the grand solution requires resources we may not possess. Perhaps a smaller operation, limited objectives, the Meuse as the goal rather than Antwerp. He spoke carefully, framing it as tactical wisdom rather than doubt. Hitler's face hardened. The small solution accomplishes nothing. We need Antwerp. We need to split their forces completely. Anything less leaves them time to recover, to reinforce, to bring their overwhelming material superiority to bear again. We strike for everything, or we strike for nothing. Manteuffel said nothing more. He'd made his point. It had been rejected. That was the end of that conversation. Sepp Dietrich, commanding 6th Panzer Army, the main striking force, had no objections because Dietrich rarely thought in terms of logistics or strategic possibility. Dietrich was a Nazi loyalist, a former bodyguard elevated far beyond his competence, and his primary qualification was enthusiasm. If Hitler said drive to Antwerp, Dietrich would try to drive to Antwerp. Whether he had the fuel to get there was someone else's problem. The meeting ended with the operation approved. Codename, Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. A deliberately defensive-sounding name to deceive Allied intelligence. Planning would proceed in absolute secrecy. The attack would come in December, when weather would ground Allied aircraft. Speed and surprise would compensate for material shortages. It would work because it had to work. Rundstedt left the meeting and returned to his headquarters. His chief of staff asked how it went. Rundstedt poured himself a drink and said, We are being asked to cross a river without boats, drive 100 miles without fuel, and defeat an enemy with 10 times our resources, all while pretending this is a defensive operation. He drank. It's madness. Prepare the orders. That was the thing about the German High Command in late 1944. They knew it was madness. They knew the war was lost, but they also knew what happened to generals who said so. 3 months earlier, after the July 20th bomb plot, Hitler had purged the officer corps. Dozens of generals and colonels were hanged with piano wire. Slowly, their executions filmed for Hitler to watch. The message was clear. Loyalty meant obedience. Doubt meant death. So they obeyed. Over the following weeks, the plan took shape. 3 armies would attack along an 85-mile front. Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army on the north, the main effort, would drive for the Meuse crossings and then Antwerp. Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army in the center would support and exploit success. 7th Army under Erich Brandenberger would protect the southern flank. Total forces, 29 divisions, 410,000 men by the time reinforcements were included. 2,000 artillery pieces, 1,400 tanks and assault guns. On paper, it looked formidable. In reality, it was Germany scraping together everything it had left. The tanks included new King Tigers and Panthers, but also obsolete Panzer Typhus and captured French equipment. The divisions were under strength. Many soldiers were teenagers or men in their 30s, pulled from rear area jobs. The Luftwaffe promised 1,500 aircraft, but everyone knew those were mostly training planes and worn-out fighters. Fuel was the critical shortage. Germany had enough gasoline to get the tanks about halfway to the Meuse. After that, they were supposed to capture American fuel dumps. The plan required capturing enemy supplies to continue the attack. Think about that. Germany was betting its last offensive on finding and seizing American gasoline stations in the middle of a battle. Manteufel kept pushing for modifications. He wanted to attack at dawn without preliminary artillery bombardment, using surprise and darkness for the initial penetration. He wanted to bypass strong points rather than waste time reducing them. He wanted to focus on speed above all else, because speed was the only advantage Germany still possessed. Some of his suggestions were accepted. Most were overruled by Hitler's insistence on doing things the traditional way. Model, caught between Hitler's fantasy and reality, tried to make the plan workable. He shifted forces, adjusted timetables, identified weak points in American lines. He worked 18-hour days that November, trying to create the conditions for success. But late at night, alone in his headquarters, he would look at the maps and see what couldn't be fixed. The Allies had 36 divisions in the west. Germany had 29 for this offensive and barely anything in reserve. The Allies had complete air superiority. Germany was betting on bad weather. The Allies had unlimited fuel and ammunition. Germany was rationing both. Model wrote in his diary, though the entry wouldn't be found until after his suicide in April 1945. We are attempting the impossible. But perhaps the impossible is all we have left. On December 11th, Rundstedt signed the final attack order. Then he added a personal note to Model. I do not believe we can reach Antwerp. I hope we can reach the Meuse. I expect we will be fortunate to cross the Our River. The Our was the starting line. Rundstedt was saying he expected to advance perhaps 10 miles before stalling. Model read the note and filed it away. He didn't disagree. He simply had no alternative to suggest. December 16th, 5:30 in the morning, darkness and fog covering the Ardennes. 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along 85 miles of front. The shells fell on American positions held mostly by green troops or exhausted divisions resting after hard fighting elsewhere. For 90 minutes, the barrage continued. Then the German infantry went forward, and behind them, the tanks. For the first day, it worked. American units, outnumbered and surprised, fell back or were overrun. German spearheads penetrated deep into American positions. Communications broke down. Confusion spread. By nightfall, Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army had advanced 8 miles in some sectors. Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, despite being the main effort with the best equipment, made slower progress, but still progress. The offensive was moving. At Hitler's headquarters, there was jubilation. The Führer had been right. The Allies were reeling. The war could still be won. At Model's headquarters, the mood was more cautious. Yes, they'd achieved surprise. Yes, they'd broken through. But Model was watching fuel consumption reports, and the numbers were worse than projected. The tanks were burning gasoline faster than planned because the terrain was more difficult than the maps suggested. The roads were clogged with traffic. The timetable was already slipping. Manteuffel, up at the front with his lead units, saw something else. The Americans weren't breaking. They were falling back, yes, but in some places they were fighting hard, and in a few critical spots they weren't falling back at all. Small American units were holding crossroads and towns, forcing German columns to deploy and fight rather than simply drive past. Time was bleeding away. On December 17th, Manteuffel's lead elements reached Bastogne, a small town nobody had paid much attention to during planning. It sat at a road junction. 7 roads met there. The Germans needed those roads to keep advancing. They expected to take Bastogne quickly, maybe in a few hours. They found the American 101st Airborne Division there instead, along with elements of other units that had retreated into the town. The Americans refused to surrender. The Germans surrounded Bastogne and kept moving, leaving some units behind to reduce it. But now, German columns had to detour around the town, using secondary roads, slowing everything down. Fuel was becoming critical. German tanks were running dry. Some units were already siphoning gasoline from disabled vehicles to keep a few tanks moving. The captured American fuel dumps they'd counted on. Most had been destroyed by retreating Americans, or were in areas still held by American forces. The plan had assumed disorganized retreat. It was getting determined resistance. By December 20th, 4 days into the offensive, the deepest German penetration was about 50 miles. They'd covered more than half the distance to the Meuse, but they'd used 3/4 of their fuel doing it, and the weather was starting to clear. That night, Model called Rundstedt. The conversation was brief. Model said, "We're not going to make Antwerp." Rundstedt said, "I know." Model said, "We might not make the Meuse." Rundstedt said, "I know that too." Model said, "Should we recommend calling it off?" There was a long pause. Then Rundstedt said, "On what grounds?" "That we were right and Hitler was wrong. You know what happened to Klug. You know what happened to Rommel. Both generals. Dead, one forced to suicide, one possibly murdered. Both suspected of defeatism or involvement in the July plot. We continue until Hitler orders otherwise." Model hung up. He looked at his operations officer and said, "Prepare plans for withdrawal. Don't tell anyone. Just prepare them. We'll need them soon." December 22nd. The weather cleared. The sky filled with Allied aircraft. American fighters strafed German columns. Medium bombers hit supply routes. Heavy bombers struck rail yards and fuel depots in Germany. The Luftwaffe tried to contest the air but was swatted aside. Germany had promised 1,500 aircraft. Maybe 300 were operational. They lasted about 2 days before losses made further operations pointless. On the ground, German tank crews watched American P-47s circle overhead and knew what it meant. They were targets now. Every time they moved, they'd be spotted and attacked. Fuel trucks became priority targets. Ammunition columns were hit. The roads became killing zones during daylight hours. Movement had to happen at night, which meant everything took twice as long. Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, the force that was supposed to lead the drive to Antwerp, had stalled completely. Dietrich's tanks had run into American resistance at Elsenborn Ridge and been stopped cold. His SS Panzer divisions, the elite units with the best equipment, had battered themselves against American positions for days and gained almost nothing. Now they were stuck, out of fuel, under air attack, going nowhere. Dietrich called Model and said, "I need fuel, I need ammunition, I need air cover." Model said, "I don't have any of those things to give you." Dietrich said, "Then what do I do?" Model said, "Hold your positions. We're shifting the main effort to Manteuffel's sector." Dietrich, to his credit, didn't argue. He knew. It was over for 6th Panzer Army. They'd become a static defensive force. Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army was still moving, barely, but the spearhead was now a single Kampfgruppe, a battle group, under a commander who'd gotten farther than anyone else. About 4 miles from the Moose River. That was the high water mark. 4 miles from the river that was supposed to be crossed on day 3. It was day 7. On December 26th, Patton's Third Army broke through from the south and relieved Bastogne. The siege was lifted. The Americans now had a solid position in the middle of the German bulge. More American divisions were arriving every day. The Germans had no reserves left. Everything was committed. Model met with Manteuffel and Dietrich on December 27th. The meeting lasted 20 minutes. Model asked each commander if they could resume the offensive. Manteuffel said no. Dietrich said no. Model nodded and said, "Prepare for withdrawal." Then he called Hitler's headquarters and requested permission to withdraw to more defensible positions. The answer came back within an hour. No withdrawal. Hold all ground. Prepare for renewed offensive once supplies arrive. Model put down the phone and said to his staff, "Supplies that don't exist for an offensive we can't launch to achieve objectives we can't reach." He lit a cigarette. "We're going to lose a lot of men holding ground. That doesn't matter." That was the moment. Not a dramatic realization, not a single conversation where someone said, "This is the end." Just a quiet understanding, shared among the senior commanders, that it was over. The offensive had failed. Germany had shot its last bolt. There would be no more grand operations. From here on, it was retreat, delay, and eventual defeat. But they couldn't say that. Not officially. So they held positions they knew were untenable. They fed reinforcements into a battle they knew was lost. They wrote reports describing the situation in terms that suggested temporary setbacks rather than fundamental failure. And men died, thousands of them, holding ground that would be abandoned weeks later anyway. Rundstedt, at his headquarters, received the reports and watched the bulge on his map slowly flatten as American forces pressed from north and south. He said to his staff, "We're watching the death of the German army in the west. When this is over, we'll have nothing left to stop them from crossing the Rhine." One of his staff officers, younger, still hopeful, said, "Perhaps the Eastern Front can send reinforcements." Rundstedt looked at him with something close to pity. "The Eastern Front is collapsing too. The Russians are in Poland. They'll be in Germany before spring. There are no reinforcements. There is no relief. There is only the end, and we're simply choosing how long we take to get there." By early January, Hitler finally authorized limited withdrawals. The word limited was important, not a retreat. Limited withdrawals to more favorable positions. The language mattered because admitting retreat meant admitting failure, and Hitler couldn't do that. The German armies pulled back, fighting rearguard actions, leaving behind wrecked tanks and dead soldiers. The Ardennes offensive had cost Germany approximately 410,000 casualties, killed, wounded, captured. 600 tanks destroyed or abandoned. Fuel reserves exhausted. The Luftwaffe reduced to irrelevance. And for what? A bulge in the Allied lines that lasted 6 weeks before being erased. In mid-January, Model wrote a report for Hitler assessing the offensive. The report was carefully worded. It described initial successes and temporary setbacks and need for strategic adjustment. It didn't say We failed. It didn't say the war is lost. But between the lines, for anyone willing to read them, it said exactly that. Hitler read the report and ordered planning for a new offensive in the east. Model received those orders and filed them away. There would be no new offensive. There wasn't enough left to defend with, much less attack. Manteuffel, pulled out of the Ardennes and sent to defend the Eastern Front, wrote in a letter to his wife, "We tried to win the war in December. We lost it instead. Everything that comes after is just determining the final cost." Dietrich, whose SS Panzer divisions had been gutted, in the offensive, said to an aide, "We had one chance. We knew it was our last chance, and we weren't strong enough to take it. Now we have no chances." Rundstedt, in a conversation with Model in late January, was more philosophical. "We were asked to perform a miracle. Miracles require faith. We had faith in German soldiers, German tanks, German tactics. But faith doesn't create fuel from empty barrels. Faith doesn't stop American artillery. Faith doesn't win wars when the other side has 10 times your resources and controls the skies." Model nodded and said, "So what do we do now?" Rundstedt poured 2 glasses of cognac, handed one to Model and said, "We do our duty. We defend Germany as long as possible. We try to save as many soldiers as we can, and when the end comes, we face it with whatever dignity remains to us." They drank in silence. The Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, was Germany's last major offensive operation of World War II. After it failed, the German army in the West had no capacity for anything but defense and retreat. The Eastern Front was collapsing under Soviet pressure. The strategic situation was hopeless. But here's what the German High Command didn't say publicly, couldn't say publicly, even though they all knew it. The offensive had been doomed from the start. Not because of bad luck or unexpected American resistance, because Germany no longer had the resources to win battles, much less wars. The fuel shortage alone made success impossible. Even if everything had gone perfectly, even if they'd reached the Meuse on schedule, they wouldn't have had the gasoline to get to Antwerp. The plan required capturing enemy supplies, which meant it wasn't really a plan at all. It was a gamble. And Germany's luck had run out. What they said in private in those dark January days after the offensive collapsed was simpler. We knew. We knew it was the last chance. We knew it probably wouldn't work, but we had to try because not trying meant giving up, and we weren't ready to give up. Not yet. Even though we should have been. Model would commit suicide in April, surrounded by American forces, rather than surrender. Rundstedt would be captured in May and live until 1953, long enough to see Germany rebuilt. Manteuffel would survive the war, be imprisoned briefly, then released. Dietrich would be convicted of war crimes and serve time in prison. But in those conversations in January 1945, after the Ardennes, they were just soldiers who'd been asked to do the impossible, and had failed. They'd known they would fail. They'd said so, carefully, in ways that couldn't get them killed for defeatism. And when the failure came, they weren't surprised. They were just tired. The last chance had come and gone. They'd known it was the last chance when it started. And now they knew something else. There wouldn't be another one. The war was lost. All that remained was determining how it would end, and how many more would die before it did. That's what the German High Command said when they realized the Ardennes was their last chance. They said it quietly, in private, to each other, in words that wouldn't appear in official reports. They said, "We knew. We always knew, and we tried anyway." Because what else could we do? The answer, the one none of them could speak aloud, was, we could have stopped. We could have surrendered. We could have saved the lives that were about to be wasted in a lost cause. But they didn't. They fought on for another 4 months until Germany was destroyed, divided, occupied, until millions more were dead, until there was nothing left but rubble and memory. That was the real tragedy of the Ardennes. Not that it failed, that it was attempted at all by men who knew it would fail, who knew the war was lost, but who kept fighting anyway because stopping would have required a kind of courage they didn't possess. In the end, the German High Command didn't need to say anything when they realized the Ardennes was their last chance. Their actions said everything. They'd known it was the last chance. They'd taken it anyway, and when it failed, they simply continued the war they knew they couldn't win, sacrificing hundreds of thousands more lives for a cause that was already lost. That silence, that continuation, that refusal to admit what everyone knew, said more than any words could have.